Hello, how are you today? Do you want to dive into a book that might just surprise you, whether it becomes your next favorite or one you might skip? Let's find out what readers are saying about it.
Marta the Book Slayer, who has 2,192 likes, says, "Welcome back, students. I have been reassigned to teach writing 102, so many words, so little plot. After my success with my first course, I am sure you are all aware it is expected that you have read this novel before attending my class. In order to avoid spoilers, we will be delving into three main topics: monotony, pretension, and shallowness. Fill up your favorite mug with your choice of caffeinated beverage. I promise my review will be more entertaining than this dull novel." We also have a guest speaker, Roel, so please be kind and show her some appreciation. Monotony. This book simply lacks a plot. Many will try and argue that the first and last 10% of the novel are where all the action occurs. Did I hear that correctly? Action? There is no such thing in this novel. The first 10% are a repetition of the novel description. I admit, the description immediately grasped my attention. However, I'll spare you the hours you spend reading this yawning and simply advise you that the description is sufficient enough. We can easily change the title of this novel to The Monotonous Life of Addie LaRue, and I guarantee no other revision to the novel would be needed. The title would be fitting. The whole novel is Addie walking around whining, followed by the introduction of Henry, who walks around whining and crying. Together they whine and walk around. The end. Yup. I think I accurately captured everything that happens in this plot. The writing style is so repetitive. I have read reviews that argue that although this novel lacks plot, the writing style is beautiful. This novel could be simplified to Mad Lib style. For example, she was taken back to ____ place. To ____ place. To ____ place. She was reminded of the coffee in ____ city. In blank city. In blank city. Everyone was mesmerized by her blank 7 freckles shaped like a constellation. Her beauty transcended this galaxy, and it was evidenced by her blank 7 freckles on her cheek that looked like a constellation. Maybe it simply took V.E. Schwab 10 years to write this novel because she was running out of nouns to fill up her Mad Libs. It might be hard to believe that the above quotes were made up by me, but I will make sure to include citations from the novel itself. Drawing Addie back to Marseille, to Budapest, to Dublin, a park in London, a patio in Prague, a team room in Edinburgh. Addie was used to passing glance. Her features are sharp, but feminine. Her eyes bright above the constellation of freckles on her cheeks. A kind of timeless beauty. She's been told. I was surprised to find out that her 7 freckles were only mentioned 23 times. I swear it was every other page. The only description we are constantly given. As if we had forgotten. Also, what was the use of the following quote? 7 freckles. 1 for every love shed have. That's what Estiel had said when the girl was still young. 1 for every life shed lead. 1 for every God watching over her. Was I the only one that actually thought she would have 7 love lives? Did I think that somehow this story would be a great love adventure through the 300 years? What is the point of highlighting this in the prologue and never mentioning anything about this? Again? To further highlight the pointless writing and how it's really something a 6-year-old would be able to write. No one is ever ready to die, even when they think they want to. No one is ready. He isn't ready. But it is time. It is time. Pretension. For a person that is allowed to live 300 plus years. Addie spends her life walking. I am serious, all she does is walk and think about herself. Yes, the circumstances she grew up in were tough, and I put that lightly. She had a roof over her head, Two loving parents who wanted her taken care of after their passing by marrying her off. As a woman who also values her independence and freedom, I get it, once she strikes the deal. However, Addie remains the same brat she did in the first 10 pages. She's in a fortunate position as an exceptionally beautiful white woman. Her only troubles, it seems, are when women are oppressed. We get a brief mention of war, but her troubles are quickly resolved when Luke takes her away from it all. She has the ability to be invisible, making her a great candidate for espionage or literally anything useful. But instead she cries for rescue and continues walking and thinking about herself in a different setting. Her only contribution, albeit the stupidest possible, is all the artwork about, you guessed it, herself. This girl has lived 300 years and could have easily first-hand described everything that occurred in history, but instead she has people writing about her. The cherry on top is that out of all the possible artworks in the whole fucking world, B decided to do her thesis on Addie. What are the odds? Our next character, second only to Addie in blandness and uselessness, is Henry. We all get it, life is short. This man is the stupidest character I have ever read about. Who makes such a tragic deal? And even after making such a tragic deal, who would just waste their life moping around and whining some more? When people get a second chance in life, they grasp it, they travel, volunteer, learn, teach others, anything. Nope. Henry sits there and mopes and feels bad for himself. It's pathetic. I also need to address the following quote, which made me cringe. B leans toward him. But that's the thing, Henry. You haven't been you. You waste so much time on people who don't deserve you. People who don't know you. Because you don't let them know you. B cups his face. That strange shimmer in her eyes. Henry, you're smart, and kind, and infuriating. You hate olives and people who talk during movies. You love milkshakes and people who can laugh until they cry. You think it's a crime to turn ahead to the end of a book. When you're angry you get quiet. And when you're sad you get loud. And you hum when you're happy. And I haven't heard you hum in years. Her hands fall away. But I've seen you eat a shit ton of olives. All Henry has going for himself is eating olives. Not surprising. Shallowness. Given the historic backdrop to this novel, you would think some events would be brought to light. You cannot just have a novel set throughout 300 years of history and completely disregard what was going on in the world. Racism, genocide, war, to name a few. I honestly have no idea what Henry could write about Addie because she contributed absolutely nothing and had nothing noteworthy to speak of. Every single sex scene in this novel was so bland. I don't understand how this is categorized as adult novel when things were poorly described and there was no chemistry between any of the characters. Everyone was instantly mesmerized by Addie's 7 freckles, slept with her and then proceeded to create their best artwork or music to date. The twist? It's Addie feeding them ideas about, you guess it, herself. Addie is also so stupid if she believes her deal with Luke in the end will pan out. Everything was incredibly predictable. Henry already had a second chance, which he wasted, and now he gets a third, which I can guarantee you will waste again. Addie doesn't even love Henry, so that's just so stupid. She gave away her freedom for someone she doesn't even love. She's incapable of ever loving anyone because she's so vain. The most shallow character of all is Luke. This was known from the beginning. He is the devil. The only slight redeeming point of the novel was his introduction and sporadic appearances. Why was he helping Addie? Why torture her sometimes but always ensure she's in a safe space? Give me a novel about this. I was so interested and I only maybe got 10 pages total, including an incredibly predictable sex scene between the two. Yawn, disappointing. Extra credit. Someone please recommend me some authors who actually know the definition of the word plot. Special thanks to my lovely Roel, who tolerated my spams about how much I hate this novel. So thankful that you hated this as much as I did. Otherwise our buddy read might have been quite awkward. I plan to remember this buddy read and promptly forget this whole novel in useless Addie and Henry. Meg's Book Rack, who has 811 likes, says 4.5 stars, rounded up with the tagline, "A life no one will remember. A story you will never forget. I should have known this was going to happen. The infamous book hangover. Y'all. She hurts. Everything hurts. The invisible life of Addie LaRue is an experience. I don't feel like I have ever been this beaten up by a book. It was literally like Schwab was taking an ice pick to my heart and slowly chipping pieces away through the entire story. I felt the weight of it. There were times I actually had to set it down and step away. I can't be held accountable for my actions during those moments. Honestly, it's a bit of a blur. Addie LaRue is a character who has an extraordinary story to tell. Yet no way to tell it. In 1714, she entered into a Faustian bargain granting her eternal life. The downfall. She will be forgotten by every person she ever meets. Unable to do even the simplest of things, like telling someone her name. Addie flounders for years, trying to determine how best to live within the constraints of the deal. It is a struggle. Nothing comes easy. Addie's only connection, the dark being who granted her wish. A being named Luke. These scenes of Addie trying to find her way, adapting to her new reality, were hard to read. In fact, they were some of the most melancholy scenes I have ever read. It was gripping, beautiful and painful, all at the same time. The writing was able to elicit such empathy for Addie's position. I found it to be extremely powerful. Addie eventually develops a semi-comfortable pattern for living. Until one day, in 2014 New York City, a boy in a bookstore changes everything. He remembers her, intricately weaving together both past and present timelines. Schwab sweeps you up into a love story centuries in the making. There's tender intimacy, sacrifice and tasty bites of food for thought the entire way through. Additionally, I loved the exploration of the power of the arts to transcend space and time. There's an underlining theme of art, in many different forms, creating a sort of timeless influence on future generations. It felt like a love letter to artistic expression, and I was so into that whole vibe. Overall, I think this is a very special story. One that will have a great and lasting impact on a lot of people. Thank you so much to the publisher, Tor Books, for providing me with a copy of this to read and review. I will never forget Addie, or her story. Cindy, who has 1,678 likes, says 3.5 stars. Vay Schwab has consistently great writing as always and really wrote her ass off here. I can tell many of the internal struggles that the main characters go through, particularly Henry, come from a personal place in Schwab's life. And you can feel that earnestly pouring through the pages. This book would be enjoyed by people who like slower, atmospheric, and character-driven stories. I think this works if you relate to the characters. If you don't, the narrative becomes quite repetitive and saccharine. The level of navel-gazing is 110% and really lays it on thick. It feels like watching an artsy indie film with sentimental white hipsters and a splash of magic, albeit written elegantly. Simona B., who has 1,870 likes, says 1.5. And please don't look at me like that, okay? I know. Also, mild spoilers ahead. Also, it's been brought to my attention that in the review below I got just a tiny bit technical at times. Sorry about that. I promise I am not in the least trying to come off as a conceited know-it-all. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is a manifesto of the dangers of pouring too much of yourself in your artistic creations. Does that mean that art must be impersonal? I am too much of a relativist to make a definite, let alone definitive, statement about that. But let's say I would certainly like for authors of fiction to take a leaf out of T.S. Eliot's book and try and flee their personalities when they're at work. The underlying problem of Addie LaRue, as I see it, is that it has no discipline, no sound strategy beyond the author's well. Let's see what else would meet my very personal taste now. A looseness which becomes manifest in the book's weak characterization and character development. And most of all, in its even weaker writing style. And I know, I never thought I'd see the day when I'd have to say these things of a Schwab book. But they are, sadly, true. The writing style, usually Schwab's forte, at least according to what I remember from her previous books, was particularly appalling in this one. I swear it felt like she couldn't decide whether she wanted to write a novel or a narrative poem. I've never seen such extensive, invasive use of internal rhymes in a prose work. They're literally every other sentence. Or such a generous, gratuitous, not to say pretentious distribution of line breaks. As if this were a piece of badly written, wannabe poetry. But narrative prose works are not poetry. Which is why they aren't normally supposed to make such liberal and indiscriminate use of poetic devices, especially phonetic ones, and for very good reasons. Poetry's reliance on sound, rhythm, and metaphoric charge necessarily draws attention to the textual nature of the piece, while prose narratives are normally dependent on referentiality, as opposed to self-referentiality, although I am fairly confident this was part of Schwab's plan for setting up the final metatextual plot twist, but the point is that it's all done badly. Writing a prose narrative as if it were poetry, without actually having a clue what prose poetry is. Which I don't have either. Because that's not really my thing. But certainly it isn't this disjointed collection of aggravating assonances and empty imagery. Or without even trying to frame it as such. Well, that's just begging for trouble. Especially because more often than not, all that the novel's attempts at lyricality do is trigger a ruinous fall into bathos. Practical example, to give you some context. Our heroine, Adeline, would rather die than marry. But her parents nonetheless decide to marry her away. The year is 1714. Of course, she said no. Adeline is 23. Already too old to wed. 23. A third of a life already buried. 23, and then gifted like a prize sow to a man she does not love, or want, or even know. She said no, and learned how much the word was worth. Such a dramatic and, in theory, emotionally draining moment in the story. And Schwab decides to render it in the form of a nursery rhyme. I am pretty sure you could come up with some kind of tune and sing this shit. And there are passages like this galore scattered nearly in every page. Another jewel is, this is a vile trick, she thinks. A horrid dream. But it will pass. This is the nature of dreams, they do not last. Oh, do get out of here, please. How am I ever going to empathize with the character when all I want to do is laugh? Not to speak of the patent abuse of the rule of three. The scant 5 lines above already feature 2 instances. But my favorite examples are the city names. Adeline drops completely at random. Always in groups of 3. She sips from a cup of coffee in New York. And she is back in Paris again. In Istanbul. In Naples. A handful of pages later, she hears a woman playing a song on her violin and she is drawn back to Marseille. To Budapest. To Dublin. Now, the problem is, these cities don't mean absolutely anything, plot-wise or in terms of characterization. They will never be mentioned again. They sound cool, and they fill up the 3 spaces to be filled. But I think, and I would dare say it's also pretty self-evident, that as a rhetorical device, the rule of thee is actually effective only if you can put some meaning behind the items you're listing. As it is, she could as well have said back to Agrabah, Flatland, and Bikini Bottom. And the emotional impact would have been exactly the same. Let's at least be a little imaginative while we're at it, shan't we? And these examples of casual geographical name dropping, I think, are paradigmatic of the intention animating the way the book is written. It's not what you mean that's important or poetic, but only if you make it sound like it should mean something important and poetic. The characterization, as I said before, is basically absent. You have Adeline, by authorial design. She is so purposefully not your stereotypical female that she inevitably becomes a walking stereotype. Rebellious, free-spirited, adventure-starved, want to see the world so bad. And of course, she adores books. The love child of Belle and Ariel. I'd say, Henry, Adeline's co-protagonist, would have been interesting, I believe, if the question of his mental health, if that's even what we're talking about, because everything is described so poetically and metaphorically and indirectly that it's kind of difficult to be sure and not to put your foot in your mouth, had been explored somewhat more in depth. Since it wasn't, I feel allowed to joke about how emo it is that at 26 he bargained all the years he had yet to live except one, only to have people not be disappointed in him. Because the whole thing is told without an ounce of finesse. So it feels simply ludicrous rather than actually sad. The last co-protagonist, Luke. I am not going to comment on the fact that he is some sort of ancestral preternatural force. And we're just going to call him Luke. I don't even know. I still feel like we don't know enough about him to make a statement of any kind. I myself can't believe that I am rating and reviewing this novel so harshly. But there it is. Believe me, I am just as incredulous and astonished as you are. If not, as is likely, a lot more. I was expecting The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue with trepidation, because I was so sure it would be a 4 or even a 5-star reading for me, and indeed, I feel like the premise was excellent. Full of potential and conceptually rich. It was the execution that was clearly lacking. As I see it, Schwab had probably been spoiling me a bit too much. What with Vicious and the Shades of Magic series. Oh well, next time then. Before more people go about accusing me of short-sightedness, let me point out that those adverbs are there, and have been there since the very first draft of this review. I didn't add them in this edit. I just underlined them, for a reason. The same applies to my use of such expressions as I think. I'd say, I believe. Translation. I, personally, feel that this specific book didn't manage to achieve the emotionally engaging and immersive effect it meant to have on readers because of shortcomings in the style. This doesn't rule out the possibility that some novel somewhere might employ a style similar to this and succeed marvelously. That's all. Joel Rochester, who has 3,843 likes, says. Edit. I just want to reiterate, I do like and enjoy this book. However, I also can find issue within it. I am not calling the book problematic. I am just highlighting some aspects that I believe the book failed on. If you don't want to hear that, then you don't have to read this review. I am also not calling this book racist, or making it about race, as people who typically argue against these kinds of things would say. Nor am I asking this book to be about black people. I am simply suggesting that this book would have conveyed its themes a little better if they made it a bit more universal. However, as people have also stated, perhaps this is to indicate Addie's selfishness, which I can agree with. DJ Vu, DJ Sue, DJ Vaku. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, or The Invisible Life of Addie the Street, conveys a tale about a girl who makes a Faustian bargain with the devil and is thus forgotten by everyone she meets. Addie becomes convinced she must make her mark upon the world in unique and influential ways, as she believes that an idea can spark into so much more. It is a story that deals with the consequences of our actions. How one choice can make life fall apart at the seams. and how everyone, despite everything, truly wants to be remembered by someone. I was really excited about this novel. The story that V.E. Schwab would bring. I enjoyed her Shades of Magic series and I was intrigued to read her latest novel. As a fan of books that contain deals with gods and devils, I was hoping that this book was able to deliver, especially since some of my friends had loved it too. However, whilst this book emphasized on palimpsests and the meanings of making your mark, of love, and of finding your way in the world, I was lost in how not only white but how Eurocentric this novel was. Eurocentrism. Also, Eurocentricity or Western centrism is a worldview that is centered on Western civilization or a biased view that favors it over non-Western civilizations. The writing was beautiful, but the story lacked some substance. Addie LaRue truly told us, emphasis on told, through her lens, how difficult and hard her life was. How she was only a shadow, a whisper, a lost thought in the wind. Addie LaRue desperately wanted someone to remember her, to know her name, to know her story. However, as we traveled throughout Addie's life, I couldn't feel connected to her tale, to her story. She had lived for 300 years. And yet the experiences we saw were so narrow in comparison to how grand her life could have been. We flashed back for only brief moments before returning back to New York for the main plot of the tale, and its focus on art, white culture, and history. I feel as though it concentrated on the white aesthetic of her experiences as opposed to ensuring it had good execution. The plot, is that the right word? Felt extremely repetitive, although potentially done on purpose to emphasize how painful it was for Addie to be forgotten. After a while, it began to lose its effect. Again, it could be to potentially showcase Addie becoming desensitized to her curse. However, it made the novel to be predictable, and at the end of it, I guessed what was going to happen, and I was left feeling meh. The emotional impact that the ending would have had was 85% lost. Henry's gift to Addie at the end was the only thing I felt for, the only thing I could connect to at the end. I thought he would write a novel about her life, and it just seems fourth wall breaking that the novel in the novel is also called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It emphasized the fact that words are powerful, and the words you choose mean everything. Especially in Addie's case. I also had problems with Addie's character, in the sense that she didn't evolve that much throughout the novel. I experienced the same feeling when reading another of Schwab's characters, Lila Bard. Addie is intelligent, calculated, and experienced, whilst Lila is young, naive, and spontaneous. Addie is careful of the consequences whilst Lila doesn't care about them. However, I can't help but feel that both characters are similar in the sense that their extent of evolving surrounds becoming selfless as a result of their relationships. Lila becomes selfless through meeting Kel and changing her view of the world, whilst Addie becomes more selfless through meeting Henry and experiencing what it feels to be remembered again. Whilst it was nice to see Addie change slightly and become hopeful, I felt as though she was still the same girl 300 years prior, who had made the deal, with no regards as to how the traumatic events in history have shaped her, how it was to be in a German cell, how it was to live through wars and death. Instead, the story continued its great focus on Addie wanting to be remembered like it was the only thing that mattered in the grand history of things. This is evident through her repetition of certain phrases throughout the novel, showing that she still holds on to her past, which reinforces the person that she was, is, and will always be. Addie refuses to let go of it because only she can remember her past, and thus cannot change as a person. She wants to be the same person, as it's how she wants to be remembered. She wants to be able to tell her story. One thing I did like was the anniversary between Luke and Addie. It was a nice touch and I personally enjoyed the conversations between them in the beginning. How it was two opposing forces that couldn't help but revolve around one another like two planets. Addie basically plays the longest game of doing things out of spite, just to prove a point, and I loved that Luke came back with how you thought. Although near the end, I found that Luke became a lot more possessive and manipulative, as a god such as he usually does. But for the life of me, I cannot see why people would want Addie to be with him for that exact reason. Like Team Boy who remembers Addie, or Team Tall, Dark, but White, and Handsome who not only plays with Addie, but manipulates, punishes and abuses her for not doing what he wants. Henry was Henry. Whilst he was cute and I enjoyed reading his perspective and backstory, I just felt he only existed to give Addie's story more meaning. It felt as though Henry only existed so he could tell Addie's story. And we don't get to see what happens to him after publishing the novel. His role in the novel had been fulfilled, hence he was no longer needed in the end. I just wished Henry had a greater sense of purpose. This novel is a standalone according to Schwab, but the way that it ends implies that there'll be more to the story. Is this Schwab keeping a wedge in the door in case she decides to come back to the world? Or is it just to leave readers intrigued as to how it all truly ends? We might never know. However, as I was reading this story, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Something made me uncomfortable about this tale apart from the mild existential crisis I was having about whether I'd be remembered after I died. Addie's story is white, extremely white. We are shown one black woman, B, who Addie calls beautiful. That is it. Throughout her 300 years of living, we aren't shown Addie being in any other continents apart from the UK, Europe, and America. Addie knows French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, but doesn't think to learn other languages from non-white civilizations. It seems Addie LaRue wanted to be remembered, just not by people of color. Someone managed to go around the world in 80 days whilst Addie has only visited 3 continents in 300 years. The fact the only thing she can also say about a person of color is that they're beautiful? It made me uncomfortable. This presentation of the West in a novel about the meaning of being remembered is ironic, as it's often the West that's remembered and exemplified in history, leaving the histories of people of color to be forgotten, erased. Where were the references to colonization? How France, Spain, Italy, Britain, and America partook in the scramble for Africa? She was literally going between Germany and England during this time. Also, there is no excuse for her not to notice. Oh, I don't know. Racism or the transportation of slaves? It just shows how apathetic Addie LaRue is to colonization and slavery. And the fact she didn't note it at all in her history shows how complicit she was in the system. The fact that Henry never questions her on it either? I just find that this novel displayed such a white lens. It was blinding. I find that the Eurocentric focus in this story just took the meaning of this novel away from me, as it just felt to me that whilst all these white people were trying to make marks upon the world, were trying to make themselves known and loved, B, the only person of color, was just tokenized in the narrative, in a story that focuses on the importance of leaving your mark. I feel like this book told me that the marks people of color leave just aren't important or valued. Also, Voltaire? Really? This novel shows how much privilege Addie has in not needing to care about or notice the brutality and violence that people of color suffered under during this time. It shows how fortunate she is in the fact that she feels the need to not mention it in her grand history, and instead only focus on the times in which she thought were important to her story. There is also the argument that Schwab intentionally left them out in order to not anger people of color for the representation of their countries and cultures. However, Sensitivity readers could have been employed and a majority of measures could have been taken to ensure the representation was somewhat accurate, and that there was at least more representation. We did get some queer representative though. Can I also just mention how funny it is that during the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, Addie is everywhere, nowhere, and yet fails to make one single comment about the impact of the movement? Oh yeah, it's because Addie is too self-absorbed in her curse, in the circumstances surrounding her curse, her desire to be wanted, remembered. Did Addie LaRue partake in the civil rights marches? Did Addie LaRue meet Martin Luther King Jr.? Or was she too busy having sex with Luke instead? Questions we'll never know the answers to. I adored the exploration of the meaning of art, history and love. How in one instant, memories can slip away and your life could amount to nothing. However, Addie LaRue forces you to remember her in the text, as everyone else, apart from Luke and Henry, especially people of color, are simply forgotten. This is a well-written novel and one that I enjoyed experiencing. However, I can't help but feel I am not the target audience for this book. And instead it is a story for white people and white people alone. I've been rambling for the past 3 hours, but I just hope this makes sense. LMAO, the live show for the late night book clubs. Discussion of the invisible life of Addie LaRue is on Noelle's channel. Link is here. https www.youtube.com/watch v = xtrg8